If you're planning to claim Social Security in the next few years, or if you're already collecting it and working part-time to stay busy, there's a rule sitting quietly in the fine print of this system that could cut your monthly payment by far more than you'd expect, and almost nobody explains it clearly before people lock in a decision that follows them for the rest of their life. So let's break this down properly, because the details here actually matter, and getting them wrong can cost you tens of thousands of dollars over the course of retirement. First, let's talk about the foundation of the whole system, because you can't understand the rule that's catching people off guard until you understand how your benefit amount gets set in the first place. Full retirement age, the age at which you're entitled to 100% of the benefit you earned based on your work history, has been gradually rising for decades, and as of 2026, it has officially reached age 67 for anyone born in 1960 or later. That's the completion of a phase, and that started all the way back with the 1983 Social Security amendments. And it means an entire generation of workers now has to wait longer than their parents did to collect a full check. Here's where it gets serious. You are still allowed to claim as early as age 62, and a lot of people do because they want the money sooner, or they're tired of working, or they simply don't trust the system to still be there in 5 years. But claiming at 62 instead of 67 isn't a small discount. It's a permanent reduction of roughly 30% off your full benefit, locked in for as long as you live. Not 30% for a year or two while you adjust. 30% forever. If your full benefit would have been $2,000 a month at 67, claiming at 62 can drop that down into the range of $1,400 a month, and it stays there with cost of living increases layered on top of that lower number, not the higher one. That gap compounds every single year you're alive, and for people who live into their 80s or 90s, the total lifetime difference can be staggering. So that's rule number one, and most people have at least a vague sense of it. But here's the part that genuinely blindsides people, the part that can functionally cut a payment in half without most retirees ever realizing what happened until the money is already gone. If you claim Social Security before reaching your full retirement age, and you continue working at the same time, there's an earnings test that kicks in, and it is far more aggressive than most people assume. In 2026, if you're going to be under full retirement age for the entire year, you're allowed to earn up to $24,480 from work before Social Security starts withholding anything. That threshold moved up slightly from $23,400 in 2025, but the mechanism behind it is the same, and it's brutal if you don't see it coming. For every $2 you earn above that limit, Social Security withholds $1 from your benefit. Not $1 total. $1 for every $2 over the line, which adds up faster than people expect. Let's put real numbers on this so it actually lands. If you earn $40,000 from work in 2026 while collecting early benefits, you are $15,520 over that earnings limit. Half of that, $7,760, gets withheld directly from your Social Security benefit over the course of the year. For a lot of retirees drawing a modest check, that's not a haircut, that's a huge chunk of their annual benefit disappearing, and depending on their monthly payment amount, it can easily work out to cutting several months of checks down to zero, or slashing the effective monthly amount by half or more once you average it out. And here's the twist that makes this even more dangerous. The rule changes again in the calendar year you actually reach full retirement age. During that specific year, the earnings limit jumps significantly higher to $65,160 for 26, up from $62,160 the year before. And the withholding rate becomes more forgiving too, $1 withheld for every $3 earned above that number, but only counting income earned in the months before you actually hit full retirement age. Once you cross that finish line, the earnings test disappears completely, and you can earn any amount of income from work without Social Security touching your benefit at all. So the danger zone isn't retirement in general, it's specifically the window between claiming early and reaching full retirement age, especially if you're still working a meaningful job, consulting, running a small business, or picking up part-time income during that stretch. This is exactly why so many financial advisors push back hard when a client in their early 60s says they want to claim immediately while still working full-time, because the math genuinely doesn't work out well for a lot of people in that position, and the government is going to claw back a huge percentage of what you thought was locked-in income. Now, here's a piece of good news buried inside this rule that almost nobody explains clearly, and it's important you understand it so you don't panic thinking that withheld money is gone forever. It isn't. Once you reach full retirement age, Social Security recalculates your benefit going forward and gives you credit for the months where your payment was reduced or withheld due to the earnings test. Your monthly benefit amount gets adjusted upward to essentially pay back some of what was withheld, spread out over your remaining expected lifetime. So it's not a permanent loss in the same way that claiming early is a permanent 30% cut. It's more like an involuntary, poorly explained delay, where the government holds onto some of your money and pays it back to you slowly, without ever sending you a clear notice saying that's what's happening. Most retirees find this out by accident years later, if they ever find out at all, which is exactly the rule catches so many people off guard and generates so much confusion and even anger, because it feels getting cheated, when really it's a mechanical recalculation that almost nobody at the Social Security Administration bothers to explain in plain language when you first file your claim. Now let's zoom out a little further, because 2026 has brought more than just earnings test adjustments, and if you're trying to understand your Social Security situation this year, you need the full picture, not just one piece of it. The cost of living adjustment for 2026 came in at 2.8%, which is higher than the 2.5% increase from the prior year, and it pushed the average monthly retirement benefit up from around $2,015 to roughly $2,071 starting in January. That sounds like good news on paper, and technically it is, but a huge percentage of that increase gets quietly absorbed before it reaches your bank account, because Medicare premiums, which are usually deducted directly from your Social Security payment if you're enrolled, have also been rising, and for a lot of retirees, the net effect of the raise is much smaller than the headline number suggests. Surveys have shown that a large majority of adults don't with cost of living adjustments actually keep pace with real-world price increases, particularly for healthcare, housing, and groceries. And when you consider that a huge shares depend on Social Security for more than half of their total income, with a meaningful chunk relying on it as essentially their only source of income, even a small gap between the adjustment and real inflation can create serious financial strain over time. There's also a major legislative change that's still working its way through the system in 2026, and if it applies to you, it could be worth a substantial amount of money, potentially thousands of dollars. In January of 2025, the Social Security Fairness Act was signed into law, and it eliminated two provisions that had been quietly reducing or completely wiping out benefits for millions of public sector workers for decades. Those two provisions were known as the Windfall Elimination Provision and the Government Pension Offset, sometimes nicknamed the Evil Twins by people who worked in government and public service for years. If you spent part of your career as a teacher, a firefighter, a police officer, a federal employee under certain retirement systems, or in another public sector role where you earned a pension from work that didn't pay into Social Security, these two rules used to reduce your Social Security benefit, sometimes by hundreds of dollars every single month, even if you also worked other jobs that did pay into the system. That penalty is now gone for benefits payable starting in January of 2024 onward, and the Social Security Administration has been processing retroactive lump sum payments and increased monthly benefits ever since, with billions of dollars already sent out to millions of affected beneficiaries. But here's the catch, and it's a big one if this applies to your situation. A year after this law passed, some retirees are still waiting for their full benefit to be corrected. And there's been enough delay and confusion in the process that senators have publicly called for a longer, clearer retroactive timeline to make sure everyone affected actually gets what they're owed. So if you or your spouse worked in public service, in education, in law enforcement, or in a government job that didn't pay into Social Security, and you haven't checked whether this change affects you, that's worth doing immediately. Because this is not a small technical footnote. It's described as one of the largest Social Security legislative changes in decades, and it directly increases real monthly income for millions of people who spent years being quietly shortchanged. There's also a separate rule change moving through the system in 2026 that's flying under the radar for a very different group of people, and this one is concerning rather than beneficial. A proposed rule from the Social Security Administration, currently under review, could reduce or completely cut off benefits for up to 400,000 people who receive supplemental security income, which is the program that provides financial support to low-income seniors, people with disabilities, and other Americans with limited resources. This isn't the standard retirement benefit most people think of when they hear Social Security, but if you or a family member relies on SSI specifically, this is a rule change worth tracking closely, because it has the potential to hit some of the most financially vulnerable people in the entire system. On top of that, 2026 also brought a significant shift in how Social Security verifies financial eligibility for SSI recipients. The Social Security Administration has moved toward mandatory use of a system that checks bank account and financial institution records for nearly all new SSI applications, and for ongoing monitoring throughout the life of an existing claim. Previously, in-depth bank account checks were only triggered if someone's reported resources appeared to exceed certain thresholds. Now, that kind of verification is becoming standard practice across the board, which the agency says is meant to reduce overpayments tied to resource limits that cap out at $2,000 for an individual and $3,000 for a couple, but which also raises real questions about privacy and how aggressively the government pursues debt recovery when it finds a discrepancy. And there's one more operational change worth knowing about, even though it's less about your payment amount and more about how that payment actually reaches you. By July of 2026, the Social Security Administration has been transitioning fully to a digital-first payment system, following an executive order that requires nearly all Social Security and SSI beneficiaries to receive their payments electronically, either through direct deposit or a Direct Express prepaid card, rather than a mailed paper check. The stated reasoning is straightforward. Electronic payments are dramatically less likely to be lost, stolen, or altered compared to paper checks, and the shift is expected to save the government roughly $150 million a year in postage and processing costs. There are limited exceptions carved out for people with severe disabilities or those living without reliable access to banking. But if you're still receiving a paper check and you don't fall into one of those narrow exception categories, this is a change you need to get ahead of, because a disruption in how your payment arrives can feel just as damaging as a disruption in the amount, especially if you're depending on that money to cover rent or medication on a specific date every month. So if you pull all of this together, here's the real picture for anyone trying to make a smart decision about Social Security in 2026. The single biggest lever you control is timing. Claiming at 62 instead of 67 locks in a permanent reduction of around 30% for life. Claiming early while continuing to work runs you straight into an earnings test that can withhold enough money to functionally cut your monthly income in half during those years, even though some of it eventually comes back to you through a recalculation most people never fully understand. If you or your spouse worked in public service, there's a real chance you're owed money right now through the Fairness Act changes, and it's worth checking rather than assuming the system already fixed it automatically. If you rely on SSI, there are rule changes in motion that could directly affect your eligibility, and they deserve your attention now, not after a notice shows up in the mail. And regardless of your situation, the way your payment physically arrives is shifting, and falling behind on that transition can create its own kind of financial disruption. None of this is designed to scare you away from claiming Social Security, and none of it means the system is collapsing or about to disappear, despite what a lot of alarmist headlines might suggest. What it does mean is that the rules are more layered and more consequential than most people realize, and the difference between claiming with a clear understanding of these mechanics versus claiming based on a rough guess can genuinely be worth tens of thousands of dollars over the course of a retirement that might last 20 or 30 years. So before you file, before you assume you know how this works, take the time to run your specific numbers, factor in your real income, your real work plans, your real health and life expectancy expectations, and understand exactly which of these rules apply to your situation. Because the version of Social Security most carry around in their head is usually a simplified, outdated picture, and the real system in 2020 being parts, more moving traps, and more opportunities than most people ever take the time to learn.